First tonight to the political deadlock in France. The country has entered into uncharted political territory after Sunday's parliamentary election left none of the three blocs with enough seats to govern outright. The left-wing New Popular Front took the most, with President Macron's centrist alliance coming second. The two blocs, which had agreed on a tactical voting pact, pushed the far-right National Rally into third place. The polls had predicted them to win, but the results showed otherwise. The leader of the National Rally Party, Jordan Bardella, blamed what he called an alliance of dishonor, with the other parties promoting tactical voting to block his party. And there were scenes of jubilation in Paris when those results started coming in. Meanwhile, President Emmanuel Macron has asked his Prime Minister to stay on as a caretaker after he offered his resignation. We'll look at the moves ahead in France in a moment. But first, Russia has carried out a massive and deadly bombardment of Ukrainian cities a day before a major NATO summit begins in Washington. Ukrainian officials say at least 33 people have been killed across the country. In the capital, Kyiv, the main children's hospital has been hit, and some children are reported to still be trapped under the rubble. Russia reportedly launched more than 40 missiles at Ukraine. In another development, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on the international community to help Russia and Ukraine resume direct dialogue to negotiate an end to the war. His comments were made during a meeting with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Beijing. Earlier, Mr. Orban, who's visited both Moscow and Kyiv in the past week, said China has a key role to play in creating the conditions for peace. His diplomacy has been criticized by EU leaders. Well, for more on all those stories, I'm joined now on the line from London by Arise European Affairs analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. Let's start with France. How do you feel about the results?
Well, first of all, it is only contained the far right. It is certainly not been defeated. It is actually the biggest single party. Please note the others are coalitions. And although this time it has not taken power, there's a clear rise in its popularity, and I anticipate that continuing, and that therefore eventually they will take power. However, what this means for now is that, as you rightly pointed out, there's a hung parliament, which means that France doesn't function very well. This won't make much difference to the French internally, because France is, of course, a very mature country, so the French can carry on without a government. However, internationally, it makes a difference in areas such as the Russian-Ukrainian war. Not so much in the EU, although France is a key player, and so there will be, again, a minor problem there in the sense that France's voice will be somewhat muted.
So basically, Emmanuel Macron has stopped Marine Le Pen from forming the next government, but it looks, as you said, like no single party has a parliamentary majority. So that essentially leaves France in limbo then. Precisely.
Moreover, please note that President Macron held this election totally unnecessarily, rather like David Cameron before in England, in Great Britain. And the result of this is now a hung parliament where previously there was a government. So he shot himself in the leg. In the newspapers, in the media in general, much is made of the fact that Le Pen did not win. But what is significant is that President Macron lost. And this means that is precisely what you've just said, that France is now in limbo, which on the international scene is important because France is an important country. And their voice, for example, in the Russia-Ukrainian war, there were plans even to send troops there, is now muted. And essentially, it no longer can speak with one voice, and it's also a matter in the EU.
So essentially, Dr. Laskiewicz, a hung parliament, three different blocs which are unlikely to get along and be able to form a government in the short term. So we have many weeks of horse trading.
Oh, I would say it could go on for longer than that. The central problem is this. Apart from the far right, the others are coalitions. Therefore, they do not even have one voice between them. They are actually made up of several parties, so to speak, and
Can
therefore it
somebody
will be
call
horse
Vet
trading,
Lake on
it's at
him?
least for weeks, at least. More like could even go for months. Um, these sort of negotiations, if you look at European history, you'll find that they can go up to 1 year. When it will be settled, I have no idea because they themselves have no idea when they settle it. For a start, no one's quite clear who will be leading the next government. The caretaker prime minister is just that, a caretaker, nothing more.
And we've heard some French voters, Dr. Laskiewicz, who say they regard the left-wing New Popular Front just as extreme as the far-right National Rally, although for different reason. I mean, what's your assessment of the fact that there are people who are as fearful of the government of the far left as they are a government of the far right?
Well, it goes back to the Cold War, doesn't it? You've got the communists on one side, the fascists on the other. Choose, as Czesław Miłosz, the Polish writer, once said. Here, of course, we're not stating that Le Pen and the far left is anything like that. But essentially, that sort of fear, that sort of choice, yes, it does affect a great many people. And the problem is that as the media portrays it, only the far right is a problem. But as you rightly point out, in many people's eyes, so is the far left. The net effect of this, of course, is that were the far left to come into power or the far right, there would be people that would be not only fearful, but quite possibly tempted to go further and demonstrate, which would make France even more ungovernable.
What I find astonishing, really, is that at the recent European elections, people voted for the National Rally, and the first round of the French parliamentary elections, the National Rally came first again. So, I mean, that suggests that that's what the French people want.
I would say, on the whole, a sort of muted yes to that point. It has to be stated that the only reason why the far right didn't win is because there was tactical voting on a scale which I, for one, have never seen before. It meant many parties combining to just have one candidate to stop the far right. Whether such a move can ever take place again, I don't know. It does, though, suggest, as you said, and as I stated before, that the far right is on the rise, and it's only a question of time before they do win. So what we're likely to see is a great deal of horse trading. I think in the long run, more elections will take place, and I do suspect the far right will actually win in them.
And on the back of what you've just been saying there, Dr. Laskiewicz, a brief word on President Macron. He didn't have to call these elections. It was a massive gamble. Do you think it's paid off in any way?
No, I think he's made a huge bungle. There was no need for the elections. He had a perfectly stable situation. The fact that the far right had won the EU, to be honest, the EU Parliament is not of great importance, more symbolic than anything else. And therefore, he could have stayed in power perfectly reasonably. He shot himself in the foot. And as such, I'm not surprised there are calls for him to resign, because to be honest, he has bungled it. And as a result, the world is worse off because France, I say, is now not a strong international player, and the French are too.
And talking about the world being worse off, I mean, let's turn to the war in Ukraine, where Russia has today unleashed a barrage of missiles on Ukraine, with dozens of people killed at the main children's hospital in Kyiv and across the country. It comes a day before a NATO summit begins in Washington. And this attack presumably will ensure that Ukraine is top of the agenda at that summit.
Yes, I go one step further. The whole attack is actually a gigantic PR exercise to show NATO Russia's alive and kicking, has no intention of stopping the war, will take it to any extreme necessary. And please note, there is a visit from India now. China and Belarus are holding some sort of group, holding some sort of exercises. The whole impression is of, if you like, of a Russia which is growing in strength, and Ukraine, which unfortunately has yet again come under attack and shown, in this respect, a fair amount of impotence, and NATO too. So therefore, what he has done is he's forced NATO to essentially do something because it has shown itself up to be a weak organization. And here, of course, going back to the previous report, Macron, now weakened, cannot give a strong voice, and that's to say France. And of course, America is in a bad state as well, because there are many doubts about President Biden. So therefore, this attack was a deliberate PR exercise to show how weak the West is and how Russia is growing in strength.
The Ukrainians, of course, have promised retaliation. We're going to have to see what they do and how much that might also escalate the crisis. Meanwhile, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister and ally of Russia, has been visiting China on what he calls his peace mission for Ukraine, saying that Beijing has a key role to play in creating the conditions for peace. What is your reading of that?
Well, Viktor Orban is indeed on a one-man or one-country crusade because the EU has made it quite clear it does not accept him as a negotiator. However, because he is the head of the EU in whatever symbolic role you want, but still the head of the EU, it does once again show how Russia and China and the war has become normalized for much of the world, which sees only that this leader of the EU has now come to China as well. His words, honeyed words for China, mean that China is now, in his view, a global player, which the Chinese have long insisted upon they are. And the net effect of this has been to strengthen Moscow in more ways than one. And therefore, it is quite clear that Viktor Orban, you could describe quite easily as an ally of Russia. Certainly by his actions, he has demonstrated more, I think, in favor of Russia than Ukraine, which incidentally has never shown any support for any of his peace initiatives.
So what's your overall assessment then of all these moves that you've talked about here? What does that suggest for Ukraine? That things are likely to get better or worse?
Worse. This has strengthened Russia's hand. Viktor Orban has helped strengthen it. Also the weakening of France, the weakening of America, all this strengthens Russia's hand and means that now Russia has got once again an opportunity to press on. And therefore, I anticipate more attacks, and indeed Russia may well go further, because if France is weakened, as it is, and America, then to be honest, Ukraine is weakened as well, because it cannot stand by itself.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is a RISE European Affairs analyst. He was talking to me on the line from London there.